Indigenous Child Trauma by Alejandra Maldonado and Angelina Barbosa. Background on Indigenous childhood trauma. Trauma affects children from all nationalities, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds. However, Indigenous children can experience trauma differently than the majority of the population due to the traumatic histories of colonization and marginalization. Indigenous children can experience trauma differently due to possessing unique characteristics, lifestyles, geographies, and communication between tribes and groups. Indigenous populations are distinguishable from the rest of the population due to their immediate connection to the land as first inhabitants. The majority of Indigenous communities have long-lasting trauma from introduced disease, violence, experiences in land disposition, and witnessing many deaths. For many Indigenous individuals, the traumatic history of colonization still feels heavy in the air, with contemporary living disparities connecting the past and the present in significant ways. The concepts of historical trauma and historical trauma response may contribute to understanding the difficulties facing some Indigenous groups. Generational trauma, the lasting effects of colonization, infectious diseases, mental, physical, and emotional trauma, generational wars, fights over land and territories with Native Americans, displacements of families and relocation, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, current day assimilation policies, boarding school, and cultural losses. With the colonization of Native Americans by English settlers, many Native American communities and tribes were exposed to diseases such as smallpox, influenza, measles, and even chickenpox. Because of the lack of immunity to these contagious diseases, many Native American communities suffered through massive death waves brought on by disease and colonization. With a history of major traumas, this can affect how Indigenous individuals feel and their ability to contribute and willingness to engage in government systems today. Because of the mistrust in systems and government, this may affect Indigenous children in a number of ways, such as standing in the way of Indigenous client reporting, turning to law enforcement for protection, or supporting family members in mental health treatment. Due to the constant conflict between English settlers and Native Americans, many Native families were destroyed and children lived in constant state of alert and stress from the village raids. In an effort to conquer land and expand, the United States government allowed for Native American families to be displaced, transported, and relocated in order to expand from coast to coast. This used to be dealt in treaties or in exchanges of goods or land, but after the Indian Removal Act of 1830, many Native families, communities, and tribes were forced out of their land, some separated, and resulting in death of many individuals. In most Native American communities, assimilation policies such as the removal of Indigenous children from their families and subsequent placement in foster care or boarding schools, and the criminalization of traditional religions and languages has resulted in Indigenous peoples' past have contributed to the construction of their identities, histories, and culture. Symptoms of historical trauma: unresolved grief, emotional and psychological wounding across generations, high rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal behavior, and substance abuse. The concept of historical trauma recognizes the abuses of the past while acknowledging that thriving, healthy Indigenous people may be affected by historical trauma and produce historical trauma responses rooted in their own resiliency. Traumatic intergenerational memories, sometimes dating back hundreds of years, may ground a family within its traditions, spirituality, values, and beliefs. However, for Indigenous families, some proposed symptoms of historical trauma include somatic, psychological, physical, and spiritual problems relating to the unresolved grief caused by colonization and presenting as high rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal behavior, substance abuse, disruptive relationships, and other diagnosable disorders. Services for Indigenous children. When discussing current struggles of Indigenous children, clinicians look to the past to explain aspects of Indigenous children's present realities within the context of systems, trauma, grief, and loss. Practice with agency settings should also acknowledge trauma differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous clients and work to provide treatment drawing from the client's specific ethnic and tribal backgrounds and value systems. Without a basic understanding and exploration of the potential strengths and cultural value systems of a client's family, providers miss out on major tools that can assist in the client's healing. Conversely, lack of clarity about cultural value system is likely to lead to a very detrimental misunderstanding of the client. Therefore, it is important for clinicians, when developing and implementing treatment for child trauma, to acknowledge the past while looking to the future.